Kwe kwe, makwe wabshi kwe indigenous cause, makwa na dodam. Shabada bajwa no niki unakan na donjaba, tichber nandayan, minoki jibawan. What I said in Algonquin is, hello, my name is White Bear Woman. I belong to the Bear Clan, and I reside in the traditional ancestral lands of the Shabada Bajwan First Nation. Good morning. I'm here to talk today about traditional food sovereignty, and the one item that I'd like to focus on is wild rice. Wild rice is actually a grain, it's not a rice, and it's called, some places call it watergrass, and it has an important cultural significance for the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, the Blackfoot, the Cree, the Algonquins, and it goes back to our teachings about migration. And at one time, the glaciers covered most of the northern part of Turtle Island, which is North America. And as the glaciers started to recede, prophets came to the First Nations and said, you're going to have to move because there's going to be a population increase, and you're going to follow the lands to where the food, you find food on the water. And so it took about 500 years for the migration to happen. And as migration was happening, as the glaciers were receding, and as new lands became available, the First Nation members moved along the waterways following the little mega shells, or they're also called cowie shells, and inland. And as they migrated, they would stop, stay in an area for a little while, and then they would migrate again, following these shells until they found the place up in Lake Superior where the food was growing on the water. And that was the wild rice. It's called monoman in our language, and it means the good food or the good berry. Min is the word we use for berry, and Minot is our word for good, or well, or fine. What is really interesting about wild rice is that it isn't only food for us, it is also food for a multitude of other creatures in creation. And it has an importance in our ecosystem that most people don't realize. A lot of places where we have cottages, people go down to the waterfront and want to make a beach, so they take the weeds out of the water, and they don't realize that sometimes they're taking the wild rice out. And then they don't understand why the lake habitat changes it, and it isn't as good as it was before. And the reason for that is that although wild rice provides us with a food in its grain and in its stalk that can be eaten as a vegetable, the roots are really important in the ecosystem because they take the heavy metals out of the water. They take the impurities out of the water. They actually help to hold soil and prevent soil erosion along the shores of the rivers and the lakes. They provide safe habitat for endangered species. They provide food for bitters and terns and swamp hens and geese and ducks and muskrat, and other animals actually use the rice paddies as habitat for making their nests and for living. Pickerel and perch actually even have been found to be living in among the reeds of the rice in the water in their rice beds. When we think about rice, normally the image that comes to mind is the rice paddies over in China. But in North America, our rice actually grows along the edges of lakes, rivers, and swamps, normally in the same environment that you would find cattails. And they can actually expand and grow. I have been privileged to go and harvest wild rice from a rice field. That's what we call it down here. From a rice field that is almost 75 acres of rice. And so when we go to harvest, when they take the canoes out into the rice, to harvest it, there's so much rice, and the rice plants stagger in height depending on what species it is that's growing, that they can be like halfway across the lake and all you can see is the top of their hats. So that's a really big field. And when we're harvesting the rice, we harvest it traditionally in our canoes. And the reason for that is that it leaves less of a footprint in the rice field. And you can actually, by harvesting, and when we say harvesting, we have one person in the front that's pulling or paddling to move the canoe through the rice field. And the person at the back has two sticks or knockers or thrashers. We call them ricing sticks. And they fold the rice over, and then you don't even hit the plant. You tap the stick that's resting on the grass, and you tap it, and it knocks the loose seeds of rice into the bottom of your canoe. And when you release that and you go to the other side to bring it over, any of the rice that hasn't fallen but is still loose, you reseed the bed when you let the rice go, because then it flies and lets any of the loose rice fall off into the ground or into the water, and it sinks to the bottom to germinate. When they're going through and they're doing this while we're harvesting and reseeding, you can actually, if you're there as it starts to ripen, you can actually go back 4 or 5 times to reharvest. Now, when colonists learned about the wild rice and wanted to harvest it, and they made wild rice harvesters, so like, what do they call them? Airboats, the ones that go over the surface to knock down the rice. You could only get one harvest from that because it would break the stems of the rice. And so they could only take the rice off of the plant once, and the stems and the leaves would be broken so that they wouldn't be able to ripen and get more food. And so then you had the process of sometimes the plants would come back up the next year, or they wouldn't. So when the seeds get knocked off and they fall into the water, there is a 10% of whatever goes into the water is used as food by the animals. And then the neat thing about the rice is that it will float with the current. It needs to have moving water in order to grow, so it has oxygenation. But where the seeds fall, some seeds will germinate the next year, some seeds will germinate 2 years later, and some can actually wait up to 5 years to germinate. So even if you have a bad harvest or a bad year with drought or anything that affects the ecosystem, the rice still has the chance to propagate and come back up the next year. So it's done, I think, as a way to make sure or ensure that the food will always be present, even if we have a bad year, or bad weather, whatever happens to that ecosystem, where there's 1 year where there's not a lot of food available, it ensures that there's food for the next couple of years coming afterwards. Wild rice, when we're harvesting it, because it's part of our culture, we have a ceremony before we go out to harvest the rice. We give an offering, and we lay our tobacco, and we do a smudge before we go to harvest the rice. And going out in the canoe and knocking it into the canoe is the very first step in the process of gaining your wild rice to eat. Some of the rice that is taken is processed down into food, and a portion of it is always saved for reseeding or to seed nude beds, because there are parts of the habitats of different places like Rice Lake where the rice was over harvested, and then they had commercial harvesting go in there and ruin the beds, and other effects from humankind have ruined some of the beds. And so we're now trying to reestablish those beds and get them going again. With the wild rice, when we go to harvest, when we go out to the canoe and we have our person that's pulling and the person that's knocking the rice into the canoe, part of the excitement of doing that is that sometimes you end up coming across a goose nest or a tern nest or a muskrat nest, and they get as surprised as you are because you're there. And so some of the excitement comes from having the animals surprised to see you. Sometimes it's nice that you can actually see them before you get there, and it gives you an opportunity to see them in their natural habitat. Once we get the rice on shore, then the second step of the ricing process is to lay the rice out to let all our little friends go that we harvested with it. So the rice actually is food for rice worms, and we have spiders and different little bugs that like to live in the rice and the stalks, and that's part of where the food comes from for the other animals. And by laying it out and letting it dry that way, it gives the opportunity for those creatures to escape in the process. Once it's been dried for a little while, normally we dry it for 3 or 4 days if we can, and turn it and rake it so that it gives an opportunity for as much moisture to get out as possible. Then we take it to a ricing bowl, which can be a hole dug in the ground with a skin put inside it, or it can be a cast iron pot. We have great big cast iron kettles that we put the rice in sometimes to work with. So the first part of it is trying to get it dry, and once it's dried, then it's danced. And so dancing is the process where somebody takes and puts on clean moccasins, and they step and twist their feet as they're moving around on the rice to break down the hull, because there's a hard hull on the outside of the rice, and then the seed inside is soft. And so you have to break that hull. Normally, the process of it sitting in the water and the water freezing actually helps to break down the rice in order for it to germinate. But because we want to eat it and not have it grow, we want to break the hull off of it. Another way that we've done it is to put the rice in a cauldron and start a fire under the cauldron. And what we do is we use a big spoon or a paddle with a shorter handle, and we stir the rice over the fire until we hear it start to pop. And so what the heat does is the heat helps to get rid of the extra moisture that's in there, and it bursts the shell open. Then that is taken and put into the ricing bowl or the ricing pit, and it's danced to break the hull down. And then once that's been done, it is winnowed. So it is taken in a big flat, we used to use birch bark bowls. It's called a winnowing bowl. It's about 3 inches, maybe 5 centimeters high on the sides, but it's large, long, flat, shallow pan. And you would put the rice that you've danced on in there, and you would flip it so that it would go up in the air, hopefully when there's a breeze, and the breeze would blow away the chaff or the outside of the hulls of the rice, and the rice would be heavier and fall back down in the pan. And so you would do this until you would be tossing it until there was hardly any chaff left, and then it would go over into a container, and that's where you get to sit down and pick through the rice to try to get rid of as much of the chaff as you can. It is a long process, and normally it's done during the ricing moon, which is towards the end of August, the beginning of September. And when we are doing this, we can share stories about the last time we went ricing, or share stories about animals that you've surprised when you were ricing, or just general conversation or ask questions. And it's a time when you're doing community work together where you get to share and you get to do some bonding as well. Once that's done and it's been cleaned as much as possible, then it's divided up between the families or community members that have worked on it, or if you're doing this for the community, then it's divided up into portions for the number of families that are in the community. What I really like about this was that this was a food that keeps on giving. So if you were to get a box of minute rice and you were to take a cup of minute rice and a cup of water, and you were to cook that on the stove, you would end up with a cup of rice. But it would expand enough that you might end up with 2 cups, okay, because of the water content. With the wild rice, you put in 6 times the amount of water that you have. So if you have 1 cup of rice, you would put in 6 cups of water. And you would bring the water to a boil before you added the rice. Once it's a rolling boil, you stir in the water so that you stir in the rice in the water to make sure all the rice gets wet. Then you would take it off the heat, put the lid on it, and sit it on the back of the stove. And you would let it sit there while you prepared the rest of your meal. And when you went back to the bowl to take it, you would have 6 cups of rice. So it actually was a means of having food that you could carry a little bit with you, but it would feed a multitude of people. And so that was one of the reasons that we saved the rice and process it the way we did, because we could store it dried and it would last winter, summer, it didn't matter. And it would last for an extended period of time. So you always had a food that you could share with somebody else because you knew that it was going to multiply when you cooked it. When we go to gatherings, and when I have gone to gatherings in the last couple of years, when we go to our Algonquin gatherings, our traditional breakfast is a wild rice breakfast. So we cook the wild rice up. And what's cool about wild rice is once it's cooked, you can bag it and freeze it, and you can take out just what portions you want of it and just heat it up, and it's good to go. So we would cook wild rice, make sure we had the volume that we wanted. We would add traditional nuts, so hazelnuts, walnuts, if you wanted to put almonds in there, any kind of nut that you wanted to add. And then berries that are in season, you would add those in as well. And a little bit of maple syrup, because that was our sweetener at the time. And you would stir it in, and that would be your traditional breakfast. And that provides you with niacin, riboflavin, fiber, protein, carbohydrates. It was a traditional all-around food. So you could have a bowl of that in the morning, and that would give you enough nutritional content for it to carry you through the day. As I was talking earlier about the rice and traditional harvesting, one of the things that we used to do is that on the map that you see over here, it shows about the traditional First Nation groups that were here pre-contact. One of the things that is nice to bring up is that we had a thriving economy with trade. So we didn't always have what we wanted, but we had lots of what we could harvest in our area. So what happened is that if we harvested a lot of wild rice, or if we harvested a lot of birch bark, and we had cedar, and somebody that lived in an area that didn't have those things came to trade, well, then we could trade those items for things that we wanted. So the Algonquins actually were the first ones that I know of that used to charge a tariff for traveling up and down the waterways for trading. And so part of the tariff was items that somebody wanted to go and trade. So if the Mohawks wanted to go up to Lake Superior to trade for something, we might trade them. They might give us some corn for being able to use the waterway. If they were coming down and they had got moose meat or something else from where they were, and we had lots of rice, or we had birch bark or other things that they wanted, we would trade that for items that we wanted to supplement our food and our supplies. And so this helped all of us survive and have the materials that we needed to survive, where we looked after one thing, another group looked after another, but everybody had what they needed because we would trade. When the Europeans came over, sometimes through misadventure, they might lose their food supplies or stocks while they were traveling and doing stuff for the Hudson Bay Company. And so what would happen they would come to a village and they would trade pots and pans or knives or other trinkets or things that they had in order to get food stores to help them travel and finish their trade route. And so that is how some of us ended up with different grains of rice. So there's 4 different variations of rice, of wild rice. One is only in Europe. There's one in Texas. And there's 3 or 4 that grow in this area. So there's the short rice that only comes to like a foot above the water. Then there's the medium-high one that comes like 3 feet above the water. And then there's the northern wild rice, which is the rice that we harvest, that can come anywhere up to 6 feet above the water. And so when you have people out there in the canoes and you're harvesting, depending on what variation of rice, you might be able to see the harvesters, if it's the short rice, all the way across the field. If it's a longer rice, you can look across the field and you may only be able to see the top of their hat or the top of their head. And so later on, you'll be able to see some pictures where I say there are wild rice harvesters out there. I'll give you a hint. There's at least 3. How many can you find? And you'd be surprised at how many are actually out there in the picture that you'd be hard-pressed to find because the rice is so tall you can't really see them. With our wild rice, with colonization and commercialization of our wild rice, our concern is that the rice started dying off because it was not being treated the right way, and that with growth and people buying land around the lakes, they were taking the wild rice out of the lakes along the lake edge because they wanted beaches there to swim in it, or they wanted to put a boat launch in to get their boats in the water, without thinking about the impact that these actions would have on the lake and the impact that these actions would have on the ecosystem in that environment when this was being done. So right now we're trying to make sure that our food sovereignty is intact, and so we're proponents for not changing the shorelines and to make sure that rice beds that have been established for a long time are not being abused. And we're trying to reestablish rice beds in places where there traditionally were rice beds where damage has already taken place. With this as well, the rice bed itself, the plant itself, helps the ecosystem to sustain other animals that are endangered, such as our turtles, some of our fish, some of the birds that we have. And by making sure the rice is there, we're also ensuring the habitat is there and is provided for those animals that are at risk. We want the knowledge of our foods, our traditions, and our medicines to be shared, but we also need to have the respect shown to them so that it's not abused, overused, or destroyed because of ignorance of what the importance of it is. When we're talking about wild rice, sometimes we think about it's just like rice, but it's not. Wild rice actually has a nutty flavor to it. And so I've had traditional rice pudding, and then I've had traditional wild rice pudding, and it has a totally different flavor. And so what I'm going to suggest is that if you access wild rice, I know that sometimes you can buy it itself at Walmart or at Food Smiths or Fresh Boys. I'm not exactly sure. And there's health food stores that sell wild rice. You can purchase some to try some of the recipes that you want, and I'll see about putting a recipe on here that you can try later on if you like. It's really nutritious and healthy, and the thing I really like about the wild rice is that it's gluten-free. So it's a natural food source from North America, and so Indigenous people that come from North America do have food sensitivities to foods that are introduced and have been introduced over a long period of time, and we call those the 5 white gifts. That's sugar, lard, flour, salt, and milk. And these are not foods that we would normally traditionally eat, but because of the environment that we live in and colonization, our diets changed. And so a lot of people that are First Nation have diabetes, they have celiac disease, they have Crohn's disease, they have fibromyalgia. These are all immune deficiency diseases that happen 9 times out of 10 because of eating foods that are not traditionally in their traditional food realms from where they are. It's eating something that's been introduced. So it would be nice to see people take the opportunity to try indigenous food from the area, and to know about that history and what the effects of colonization has had on different people. We need to make sure that our medicines are safe. We need to make sure that our traditional foods are safe. And although it's not a traditional food for some people, we need to respect that there are indigenous groups that have certain knowledge about plants and animals that they use for food that we may not use for food, and we don't have the right to tell them that's wrong, they can't do that, because that's their cultural teachings. The same as I would expect that they would honor my cultural teachings and give me the same respect if I'm eating something that's strange or different to them. Sometimes people are scared because they don't know of something, and so it's nice to provide them the opportunity to try it, so then they have that experience. And then they can make a judgment on their own through their personal experience about how it is. When we're talking about wild rice, the other thing I like to think about with wild rice is the Three Sisters soup. And that's corn, beans, and squash. And so my family has a small variation of that. We make harvest soup, so it has corn, beans, and squash. It has wild rice in it. It has meat from whatever game that we've harvested, whether it's duck, muskrat, beaver, bear, venison, or deer, or moose. That gets put in there. And then we put our roots in there, such as potatoes and carrots. That adds staple and flavor to things. And our sweetener normally is maple syrup, and that's what we harvest from the maple trees in the spring. And that is also one of our medicines. We have a ceremony that goes with that as well. When we're talking about my favorite time of the year is when I go out in mid-August to where the rice field is, and you can just see the water, you don't see the plants yet. It's actually the stage of the dancing leaves. It's where the leaves come just below the surface of the water. The only portion of the rice plant that actually comes above is when it pollinates and it produces the rice. So this is just before that period where you can see the rice kind of dancing under the waves. And then you know, when it does, once the temperature does rise, I think it's like 75 degrees is when the rice will pop up through and germinate, and then we go back to harvest. It's so nice to see the animals and the ducks and that out there on the water before the rice comes up, because once the rice comes up, you can't see them until you get out there in the field and they come upon you or you come upon them and get surprised. With this, what I'd like to say and remind everybody is that the wild rice is really important because it keeps our fresh water fresh. It takes the heavy metals and pollution out of the water, and it actually is one of the filters that help to give us fresh drinking water and have drinkable water. So we need to make sure that we're doing what we can to keep the lakes and the rivers and the streams and the marshes clean of pollution, because they have a hard enough time with the stuff that's in the air and the water already. And every little bit of waterways that we clean up, it actually improves the water around the world. And the water that we have in our backyard travels around the world because it has no barriers. Water is constantly in motion, whether it's in liquid form, gas form, or solid form. And whatever we do in our little corner of the world to improve water quality actually improves the water quality around the world. So we need to make sure that we're doing our part. The humans in creation are the only ones that create pollution and garbage. So it is our responsibility to try to stem that flow and change the way it's happening so that we help to get rid of the garbage and reduce the amount of the footprint that we're leaving on Mother Earth.
Wild rice harvesting and processing with Kokomakwa Cultural Enterprises. Starting of the harvest, we lay Nasama down before entering the fields to harvest, to give thanks for the food on the water and to give back for what we are about to harvest. Pa, my husband James, and Moose, my son Alex, getting ready to head out in our canoe. Using a canoe to harvest leaves less of a footprint in the rice field and is less disruptive to the wildlife that live in these fields. The rice is so tall that you can only see the person that is pulling or paddling in the canoe. The harvester is not visible as they sit in the back of the canoe to harvest, thus is lower. The rice is harvested and dropped into the middle of the canoe by the use of ricing sticks made from cedar. There are 5 canoes in the water harvesting. And yes, all the light green grasses that you see in the picture is wild rice. The wild rice goes out as far as to the clear water at the horizon. In the picture where the trees start, the little blue line is where the open water is. Yes, there are 2 people in that canoe. Can you find the other person? Look along the edge of the picture frame. You may be able to distinguish the ricing sticks. Community members receiving teachings on ricing at the edge of the water while they wait for their turn to go in the canoe. Our friend for Plenty Canada, Libby, is sporting the country look. Smart woman. It is a good idea to have your hair covered and tied and layered clothing, as there are a lot of spiders and rice worms that will land on you as you are going about your business, harvesting the rice. There is also little ladybug type bugs that also live in the rice bed. And the rice will stick to your clothing, so it's always a good idea to dress in layers or bring clothes to change into after the harvesting is done. Moose, my son Alex, getting out of the canoe. I really need to get him a form of a seat for the canoe. He says it's a bit hard on his knees. At the bottom of this picture, there is a set of cedar ricing sticks that we use to harvest the rice. The stick should be as long as your arm, and the diameter should be at least the diameter of your thumb to maybe a ½ an inch. The sticks are whittled down to a point at one end, and we use this to comb through the rice and pull the grass over top of the canoe without breaking the stems. And the other stick is used to tap the stick that you've folded the rice with to vibrate the rice and allow the rice to fall into the bottom of the canoe. Any rice grains that did not fall, that are loose, when you release the grass, it will cause it to fling the loose seeds and reseed your rice bed for further years to come. It also allows food to be put on the water for any of the inhabitants in the ricing area that would not normally get the rice. In this image here, you see wild rice grains that have been dropped into the canoe. You'll notice that there is a hole on the rice grain itself. The rice grain will be a dark brown, and there's a long hair attached to it, which is used by the plant to help have the grains removed when animals or birds move through the rice fields. These will be removed during our processing. On the rice at the top is one of the rice worms I was talking about. If you look at the bottom of the cup where the rice grain is sitting, you'll see that the rice worm is actually like 1/3 the length of the rice grain. These little creatures will get in your hair and in your clothing as you are pulling or ricing and harvesting the rice. It's always a good suggestion to dress in layers. In this photo here, we see where the second shift is beginning. It sometimes takes 2 or 3 days in order to harvest the rice. There's a lot of rice to gather. I am still amazed about the amount of wild rice growing in this area. We were told that this rice was not sown unless it was sown by our ancestors hundreds of years ago. There is close to 70 acres of wild rice in this rice bed. Moose is paddling and Pa is harvesting. Changing of positions is interesting if you try to do it in the water. It is safer to come ashore. After a while, if you paddle for long enough or pull long enough, you get tired of standing in the canoe, and it is sometimes a relief to switch and become the harvester instead. Can you find all the canoes in this picture? I'll give you a hint. There is at least 3. It's such a nice day, they've decided to go out for a 3rd shift. At the end of the day, and we're all packed up and ready to go. Wow, you can't even tell where the harvesters have been. Talk about eco-friendly. Again early in the morning, Moose is having breakfast on the run. Back for a 2nd day of harvesting. This is 10 days after our first time out. What an awesome day to harvest again. If done by canoe, you can go back several times whilst the rice is developing to harvest. Where if a thrasher or an airboat is used and brought in, then you can only harvest whatever is ripe at that moment, and there is not another opportunity to harvest that year, as it damages the rice stalks and destroys the beds for the harvesting for that year. As the rice falls into the canoe, it will eventually stand up in the bottom. It will work so that the grains are supporting each other and the hairs are pointing up. The end of another day of harvesting. It is amazing how many times you can come back to these fields and harvest, as long as you are doing it in a good way. Another 40 kilograms of wild rice harvested. That on top of the 80 kilograms harvested the first time we were out. And here another canoe comes in with more rice. As you can see, the bottom of the canoe is full and the rice is standing up. Processing the wild rice for storage or cooking. Yes, all this is wild rice, fresh from the beds. Now it goes to be dried, where it will be spread out on tarps or blankets, and it'll give the opportunity for the worms and the bugs to remove themselves and find their ways back to where they need to be, or to feed the animals in the area. And then we will begin the processing of the rice to get it ready for cooking or for storage. The green bin is full of the dry rice that we have harvested from the rice beds. In the cast cauldron, the rice is parched or dry heated to loosen the hull on the rice. It must be stirred to prevent scorching or the burning of the rice and end up making it not edible. The pot where the parched rice is put into to be danced. Dancing must be done with clean soles. I was told that you do not want to wear regular moccasins, as the rice will end up getting into your footwear and it will become uncomfortable. I wore my high ankle moccasins and did not have a problem with it. Jeff Beaver and me dancing the rice. This is where we are working off the hull of the rice before it is winnowed and then cleaned to be taken home to be cooked and eaten. When we dance the hull and what hull we break off, it then becomes what's called chaff, which is the dry outer layer of the grain. Winnowing the danced rice. This is where the chaff is removed from the rice. This is done several times to get as much chaff off as you can before your final cleaning of the rice. The chaff is lighter than the grain, so as the wind blows across, it will blow the chaff away from the grain, and the grain will fall back into the pot that you're pouring the rice over top of. In this picture, you see the container is full of winnowed rice. It's almost finished. One more step to go. Final step is to hand clean the winnowed rice, to pick out the kernels that still have chaff on them to be danced again. Moose is helping to do the final cleaning. I know he is thinking of rice pudding. The finished product. Now to take it home and cook it and eat it. Now you know why wild rice cost, what it does when you want to buy the finished product. Miigwech to all the participants on this journey, Plenty Canada, Heifer International, and all the community members that came along to share in this experience. Wild rice pudding. The ingredients to make wild rice pudding. 1 cup of wild rice, preferably locally harvested. 6 cups of water, 1 can of coconut cream, and 1 carton of almond breeze. By using these ingredients, this also makes it vegan friendly. First, bring your 6 cups of water to a boil. Add your cup of wild rice to the boiling water. Stir it in, reduce your heat to low, and let simmer for approximately 20 minutes. The rice is done when the grain splits and curls. The majority of the water will be absorbed by your rice. This is what cooked wild rice looks like. You should now have 6 cups of cooked rice. Add the remaining ingredients and bring back to a boil. Stir rice frequently to prevent sticking or scorching. Once it starts to thicken, remove from heat. Pudding will continue to thicken as it cools. Add maple syrup to taste. Options for a taste as well, as you could add either cinnamon and/or cloves and/or nutmeg, or brown sugar instead of the maple syrup, whatever your taste preference is. My suggestion would be to add a little bit of any of the seasonings until it was pleasing to your taste. Enjoy. Monomen, which is what we call wild rice, means the good seed. Monomen was really important to the indigenous people because it was considered a thrift food. That meant that even though you only had a little bit of it, it could multiply when you cooked it and stretch a long way. Like in our recipe, 1 cup of wild rice cooked would equivalent 6 cups of wild rice.
So I hope you enjoyed the recipe that I shared with you. Take your time. Don't try to rush it because rice has its own way of letting you know when it's done. As much as you want to check the pot, it's not going to work for you. You have to allow it to sit until it curls. And then once it curls, then it's ready for the next step. And after you've made your recipe, please share it with others so that they can enjoy the bounty of your efforts as well. Our time is almost at an end here, and I want to say miigwech for coming and sharing your time with me. Miigwech for listening to the words, and I'm hoping that we'll get to share and speak with each other again. And hopefully the next time we come around to do this, we can do this in person. Chi miigwech. Bama pi giwababin minawa.